right, well, hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this really nice day when you could have been outside. We would have done it open air if we could have, but we're really excited to have you with us. I want to first start off by saying that LaShawn Thompson unfortunately can't be with us this evening, but she did send along some welcome remarks that I'm going to read to you. So I'll start with that. So this is from LaShawn. Good evening, everyone. Please accept my apologies for not being able to participate in tonight's important discussion, as I find myself fully committed to accompanying a group of 42 teenagers on an enriching trip to Boston. Today holds profound significance, as it would have marked my beloved husband Kenny's 58th birthday, coinciding with Colon Cancer Awareness Month, thus adding an extra layer of significance to this day. It serves as a poignant reminder of Kenny's valiant battle against cancer. Even though Kenny is no longer physically with us, his legacy continues to endure. He's widely acknowledged for igniting nationwide efforts toward criminal justice reform, a commitment that was evident even prior to the events surrounding George Floyd. I strongly believe that his legacy resonates deeply with each one of us present here tonight. While we keenly feel his absence, Kenny's spirit lives on within me and our children. I want to take this opportunity to express my heartfelt gratitude to all those who have played a role in making this symposium possible, from Dean Troy McKenzie, Associate Dean Nick Vagilatos, Sue Anderson, Carolyn Schachtel, Haley Dunn, to our esteemed guest speakers, Chesa Boudin and Tiffany Caban, me, Courtney Oliva, Vincent Sutherland, and Jason Williamson. Each of you deserves my sincere appreciation for choosing to engage in this essential conversation. Your presence tonight speaks volumes about your unwavering dedication to this cause. Furthermore, I kindly urge you to consider extending your support to the Ken Thompson Social Fund, thereby enabling us to continue facilitating these important discussions in the future. With that said, I bid you all a good night and hope to have the pleasure of seeing you again next year. Thank you. Warm regards, LaShawn Thompson. So we're sorry she can't be with us, but we're very glad you are all here. And it's my pleasure tonight to introduce the panel. And I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So we'll start with Chesa Boudin, who's currently the founding executive director of the Criminal Law and Justice Center at Berkeley Law, where he has been since May of 2023. He previously served as the 29th District Attorney of San Francisco from January 2020 to July 2022. During his time as DA, the office stopped seeking money bail at arraignments and limited pretrial detention, leading to a 25% reduction in the jail population. He stopped charging juveniles as adults, expanded the office's Victim Services Division, and restorative justice and diversion programs. During his time in office, both violent and nonviolent crime fell by double digits. Now, I'm not one for criminalizing many things, but it should have been a crime to recall a DA this good.
The crime went up under you.
Before serving as district attorney, Chesa was the deputy public defender in the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. He also served as a law clerk to Judge Chuck Breyer on the District Court of the Northern District of California and to Judge Margaret McCowan on the Ninth Circuit. He was a Rhodes Scholar and went to Yale for undergrad and law school. His biological parents were incarcerated when he was a baby and served a combined 62 years in prison. So he's also directly impacted by many aspects of the criminal justice system. So our next, to my immediate left, is Tiffany Caban.
You don't have to read the whole thing. This is real long.
I'm going. I have she has been a member of the New York City Council since December 2021, where she serves on the Committee on Mental Health, Disabilities, and Addiction, the Committee on Public Safety, the Committee on Women and Gender Equality, the Committee on Criminal Justice, the Committee on Civil Service and Labor, and the Committee on General Welfare. She is a hard-working representative. She's introduced legislation to support survivors of violent crime that passed the City Council. She's also introduced a bill to track property seized by the NYPD and the DAs, and another that would bring greater transparency to the Department of Corrections and the NYPD. Before serving on the City Council, Tiffany was a national political organizer for the Working Families Party from October 2019 to December 2021. She was a candidate for Queens County District Attorney in 2019, and prior to that served as a staff attorney for the New York County Defender Services for 4 years and for Legal Aid Society for 3 years. She earned her JD from New York Law School and her bachelor's degree from Penn State. Her father worked as an elevator mechanic and her mother as a caretaker for children, both raised in Woodside Houses, a public housing complex in Queens. And in one of her campaign videos, she said her background is why she became a public defender. And then last, but certainly not least, we have tonight's moderator, Vincent Sutherland. Vincent is an associate professor of clinical law and the faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law right here at NYU. Prior to joining us at NYU, Vincent was an assistant public defender with the Federal Defenders for the Southern District of New York, and before that, he spent 7 years at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he served as senior counsel. He was a staff attorney at the Bronx Defenders and an E. Barrett Prettyman Fellow at Georgetown. He was a law clerk to Judge Ted McKee of the Third Circuit and Judge Lewis Pollack on the District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. He won the 2022 Champion of the Community Award from Gideon's Promise and earned his BA from the University of Connecticut and his JD from Temple and an LLM from Georgetown. We're so excited that he now makes his home here at NYU, and I'm going to let him take it away from here. Thank you again for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, Rachel, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to Councilmember Caban and Chesa for joining us tonight. It's rare that I get a chance to sit on stage with two former public defenders, so I'm really thrilled about that to begin with, especially in a lecture series in the name of Ken Thompson, who was a prosecutor. And so with that in mind, the hope is tonight that we can have a conversation that helps us understand how your unique roles as public defenders, former public defenders, informs your views of the criminal system, how those positions you've held in the past or even now shape your ability to advance racial justice in the criminal system, and explore the opportunities those positions present and the roadblocks and challenges those positions have as well. And so I want to start by kind of asking you, in 2019, you both moved from public defense to seeking office as a top prosecutor in the communities where you were defenders. And so before we kind of talk about that move, I want to know what inspired you to become a public defender in the first place. So Tiffany, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, just thank you for having me. And I just, listening to the remarks left by Mrs. Thompson, I just needed to name that it was a very cool moment very recently where she was present at newly minted Councilmember Yusef Salam's inauguration, which I think is just like a really, really powerful full circle moment. But I have to be really, really honest, and I don't know if this was the case for you, Chesa, but I went to law school knowing that I wanted to be a public defender. I didn't want to be any other kind of lawyer, and it's a really interesting environment because of sort of like who comes up in academia and what you'll find in different places, but a lot of the professors that are in that space doing, criminal procedure, criminal law, they have prosecutorial backgrounds. And so I went in wanting to be a public defender and having professors try to convince me that actually what I wanted to do was be a prosecutor. Until I got in, I was taking trial ad, and my professor, Robert Baum, who's a federal defender, was like, no, don't listen to anybody else. You're right. You are absolutely a defender. But that's what I went and wanted to do, and it had everything to do with my personal experiences. I think public defense is trauma work, and usually what leads people to trauma work is their personal trauma, and that was definitely true for me. It was like a drive towards wanting to have reparative experiences for myself, but also through the experience of advocating and helping others to be able to access the same. And if I had to point to very quickly to two things that really politicized me but drove why I wanted to do that particular work, had everything to do with my grandfather, which I know some folks have heard this story before, and also my experience in high school. My grandfather was a dirt poor kid from Puerto Rico. He left the island like a lot of young men were doing at the time. He joined the army. The colonization, a lot of resources, things were being extracted from the island. It was really hard to make a living. And that is what people did, and they came to the mainland afterwards. So he was a combat veteran in the Korean War, came back with PTSD, self-medicated with alcohol, was incredibly harmful and abusive to the point where my grandmother left him, my mom dropped out of high school to help take care of the family, and they were living in public housing at the time. And when unhealthy dynamics are what it's modeled for you in relationships, it's usually what you find. And so my father has had very similar struggles with substance use and a history of mental health issues in our family. We were directly impacted by violence in our communities, by economic insecurity in our community. And when my grandfather was very, very sick and he was dying, my mom finally let him back into our lives. And I was a child who was really struggling at home with a lot of the same things that she struggled through her childhood. And my grandfather was a godsend. I loved him. He was my favorite person on the planet. He played me the guitar. He was patient. He was kind. He made me feel safe when most days I did not feel safe in my home, right? And so when I got older, I made the connection that this person, this really abusive husband and father, and this really incredible, patient, kind grandfather, they were one and the same, and he was somebody who could have been cycling in and out of our criminal legal system, and we weren't asking the question of like, where were the supports to support him so that he could better support his family? And that is the perspective, the framework I bring into all of the work that I do. And then the last piece, which I promise I will be more succinct, was that despite my father's issues, being in and out of rehab and things like that, he was an elevator mechanic, a union job, right, that provided us with health care, allowed him to go to inpatient rehab several times while being able to maintain his job, making sure I had health care, I got to go to college. So despite his struggles, I don't know how he did it, but he busted his ass, worked double, triple shifts, and instead of sending me to my zoned high school in Richmond Hill that had like abysmal graduation rates at the time and was listed as one of the more quote unquote violent schools in Queens, he sent me to a Catholic high school that was like an hour away, and just seeing the difference between how the kids I grew up with on my block were treated in school when they did stupid bullshit kid stuff, and the kids that I went to school with who had access to more resources, got every chance in the world because people were invested in their futures. And really I internalized this idea around it's all about access and opportunity and resources, and those are the difference makers in people's lives. And they certainly were the difference makers in mine. So I just went into wanting to do public defense work, understanding that at the core are people and their trauma, and everybody deserves an opportunity to heal, but also access to make better choices and be healthier human beings all around, and we all deserve that. And I did not think that was possible from the other side of the aisle.
Yeah. Jason.
Well, first of all, thank you, Vincent. Thank you, Rachel, Jason. Thank you to everyone at NYU for putting this together, especially, I just flew in from California and I was like worried about the weather, and you all arranged for the kind of day that makes me want to move back to New York where I was born. So thank you. It's a beautiful day to be in New York, and it's great to see so many family and friends from all walks of life here. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be on stage with Tiffany, as always, and with Vincent.
So much.
As you heard in Rachel's generous introduction, I grew up visiting both of my parents in prison. I was born on the Upper West Side, kind of just south of Columbia University, Morningside Heights, and people in this room know what Morningside Heights is. And when I was 14 months old, my parents left me at the babysitter, and they never came back to get me. And while I was playing that day, they were driving the getaway car in a very, very serious and tragically bungled armed robbery that left 3 men, 2 police officers dead. I don't remember the day my parents got arrested. I don't even remember years later when a judge sentenced my father to 75 years to life, or my mother to 20 years to life. My earliest memories are waiting in lines to go through metal detectors, to go through steel gates, just to see my parents, just to be able to give them a hug. And way before I had ever heard the term mass incarceration, way before I could begin to understand the deep and sordid history of institutional racism in this country, I started noticing that the lines to get into those prisons were mostly black and brown women and children. And the years, decades ultimately, of prison visits taught me some really hard life lessons that informed my decision to go to law school and my passion for trying to put the justice back into the criminal justice system. And I want to be clear, I don't say that because my parents were innocent or wrongfully convicted. I say that because when you visit prisons or jails in this country, you cannot walk away thinking that the system is solving any of our problems or vindicating the rights of any people whose rights need to be vindicated. It's not doing anything that we can agree, whatever our politics. It's not rehabilitating people. It's not effectively deterring crime. It is not honoring or dignifying or healing victims who have been harmed by crime. And it is certainly not allowing our local communities, like the kind that Tiffany represents, to have the resources they need to build meaningful public safety. In fact, it's bankrupting our local governments and starving them of resources that could invest in things like healthcare and childcare. So I went to law school determined to find ways to fight against mass incarceration and to try to enhance the justice in the justice system. At that time, there was no such thing as a progressive prosecutor movement. At that time, there were no prosecutors I was aware of who were talking about decarceration, who were talking about alternatives to incarceration, who were talking about police accountability, things we can get to later tonight. But I tried not to be a public defender, if I'm honest, because I thought that, correctly thought and worried, it would be so close to home for me, with my father still incarcerated, that I wouldn't be able to separate my life and my work. And I was right about that. I mean, when I became a public defender, I kept a sleeping bag at the office. I would sleep at the office regularly. But there was this amazing concept that doesn't exist in most countries in the world, that somebody who goes to a top law school like NYU, who has opportunities to earn hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, working for the most powerful, wealthy corporate clients, can instead choose a career of public service where they get to go to court every day and represent anybody who's there in need of a lawyer, and give those people not just legal representation, but dignity. The best representation money can't buy, we used to say. It's an amazing thing if you take it seriously, if you fund it adequately, if you give those offices the independence they need to really zealously advocate for their clients. And I loved that job, absolutely loved it, because it's a magical thing to take somebody who often has never had a positive interaction with the state, who's in a moment of absolute crisis, desperation, where their whole life and freedom are literally on the line, and to step in and say, yeah, I could be working for that big Fortune 500 company, but I'm working for you, and I'm going to do everything in my power, everything the law allows, to make sure that you navigate these stormy waters with the best possible outcome. It's an amazing, amazing, privileged job to hold.
So thanks to both of you for sharing those incredibly deep and moving motivations for why you started off doing the work that you were doing as public defenders. The thing I'm curious about now is, why did you make the move from public defense to seeking office as a chief prosecutor? Just knowing,
I feel like this is a setup.
No.
Come on.
Because when I was a public defender, it was trench warfare. I could not stand the prosecutors. They were they were the people I disliked the most.
I believe you. Okay? He says it like he means it. I believe him.
And this was kind of before the progressive prosecutor movement had begun, and before Ken Thompson was. But so why make that move? Let's start with you, Chaser.
Basically, for me, it's three answers. All right, and I'll be brief. But they were, first of all, the national movement around criminal justice reform, which I've been actively involved in since I was in high school. I've been speaking out about the impact of parental incarceration on kids literally since I was in early years of high school. That movement, which was niche, fringe, not mainstream consciousness at all back in the 80s and 90s, by the 20-teens, all of a sudden, it's a much more mainstream movement, and it's a broader movement which includes people in district attorney's offices. For the first time, probably in American history, certainly in my lifetime, you have people like Larry Krasner and Kim Foxx and Rachel Rollins, people like Tiffany Caban running for the office of district attorney on platforms that are not competing to be the quote-unquote toughest or most punitive, but that instead are saying very explicitly, in cities like Boston and Chicago, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Austin, Texas, all across the country, saying things like, we can make our community safer. We can do a better job vindicating the rights of our victims if we focus on alternatives to incarceration, if we enforce laws equitably, including against police and corporations, not just against poor people of color. That was inspiring to me as someone who was watching, as a public defender, every day, the power and the harm that prosecutors could cause. Second reason is that my years of being a public defender, a job you just heard me describe how much I loved, was also frustrating. It was a frustrating job because we didn't have the tools, even in a wealthy city like San Francisco, even with an independently elected head district attorney, which is an anomaly in this country, the only one in the state of California. We did not have the independence, we didn't have the tools we needed, the resources we needed to level the playing field for our clients. In all kinds of ways I can unpack and talk about if we have time later, but the key thing for me was I was doing more and more impact litigation around bail, around immigration detainers, or Padilla compliance for the law nerds in the room. You'll know what I'm talking about, 2012 Supreme Court case. I was doing all this policy work, launching new units in the office, things that were not traditional public defender roles. And I started to realize that I was trying to change the system as a public defender when really the prosecutors had the keys. And they were the ones with far more leverage, far more flexibility, a broader mandate to actually implement policy. And the third thing, which coincided with both of those, like the very personal realization about my own work transforming, the national movement growth and breadth. The third thing was a San Francisco specific thing, which was that for the first time in 110 years, there was going to be in 2019 an open race for district attorney, no incumbent listed on the ballot. Literally the first time in over a century when the ballot was going to have a bunch of names of people who wanted to be DA, and none of them were the guy or gal in the office at the time. It was a wide open race, and I tried really hard to get excited about one of the 4 people running at the end of 2018, and I couldn't do it. And I tried really hard to find somebody to run for DA who shared my values, and I couldn't do it. And so in January of 2019, after some very hard conversations with my then fiance, with my father in his prison visiting room, after seeing the inspirational work that Tiffany's campaign was doing in Queens and that other folks around the country were doing, I decided to run.
Okay. Councilmember Caban.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, now I'm just reflecting on your run, and I'm like, I flew out during his campaign to help out with the campaign, but I just think about the day before I flew out to see you and help out on Chase's campaign. I was out at a rally in terrible weather with an organization called RAP, Releasing Aging People in Prison, and we were mourning the death of Valerie Gator, who at the time was like a woman had been serving like the longest sentence in the prison that she was in, and somebody grabs my hand, my arm, while I'm out there, and turns to me and looks at me and says, "You're going to go see my son tomorrow," and it was your mom, and that's how I met Kathy Boudin, who was just a brilliant, wonderful, amazing human being, and I take joy in reflecting on that memory. The question, why did I decide to run for DA?
Yeah.
Honestly, and it was probably true for all of you, like I feel like we all, once we get our sea legs a little bit as public defenders, we have that bit of swagger where it's like the prosecutor, a bit. And you walk down and, if God forbid somebody mistakes you for a prosecutor. Like I remember being mistaken for a prosecutor walking down the hallway of the courthouse and being like, no, I'm one of the good guys. What are you talking about? So it was like I couldn't have imagined it. I don't want to repeat what Chase has said because a lot of that is true, right? Like you're butting your head against the wall and you know what the solutions are. You know it because you hear your clients' stories every single day about what works and what doesn't work. And the other thing too about it, I always told people I would never be a line DA, but I made the decision to run to be the DA because of the power of that role. I mean, we worked with line DAs every single day, and despite being the people closest to their cases that they were handling, they had to go 1, 2, 3, 4 steps up the ladder to have a decision made about a case to then come back to you and say, this is what we could or couldn't do. And it's like, well, now the person that is 3 degrees removed from having any intimate knowledge of the case is making these really, really consequential decisions. And so it just seemed like to me, despite how handcuffed we were as public defenders, that like line prosecutors were handcuffed too by the policies and the directives of the DA. And then just, I mean, real talk, life happens, right? And so I feel comfortable enough just sort of sharing that we don't make really big decisions on our lives based on just like 1 or 2 different things, but it feels like the stars have to align. And I was watching some really incredible things happen. Larry Krasner had just done his thing in Philadelphia, and I remember my partner at the time who was from Philly, and I was like, we should think about moving there maybe, because it might be a cool time to practice. Not because I wanted to be a line DA, but it was like, might be cool to practice there, and she had roots there. And then Alexandria, my congresswoman, like ran and won And just the electoral possibilities changed. But probably the bigger thing was that it was a really hard time in my relationship. A friend had gotten me into volunteering with this organization that had asked me to do policy work that I really, really loved on criminal legal reform policy. And my partner and I broke up. And I'm sure this is true for you, or I'm assuming this is true for you guys when you're a public defender. It's like a roller coaster. And so you're either, you're either actively burning out, or you're riding some high, or you're actively burning out. And so for a breakup, like a long-term relationship breakup, to align with a burning out moment, to align with when you're a public defender, you rack up a lot of PTO and you never take any of it. And so I decided to take a little bit of time off, went on a trip with some friends. When I came back, one of my homegirls texted me. It was like, you need to run for DA. And I was like, you are out of your mind. But she had a whole plan, and she had gotten a couple of our other friends to sit me down and say, like, no, we've thought about this. We think you need to do it. And I didn't know what my future, like I couldn't see my future, right? Like my life was changing in a lot of different ways. And then I saw who was running and how they weren't serious, or they were saying some of the right things, and it was bullshit. And
Kim
so,
Ogg. Sorry,
yeah.
I'm naming names.
Yeah, yeah.
For those who know, you know.
Yeah. And so I was like, well, why not? I have the time to do this. I can call, at the very least, I could call people out on their bullshit and really speak truth about the experiences I had every day in court and the experience of my clients. And then it turned into something very, very different, and we came very, very close. But yeah, I think I'm rambling a little bit, but it was like a little bit of personal passion, strategy, like all of these things coming together in a moment where it made sense. And I was like, all right, let's go.
So that's really helpful, and I think it helps provide a lot of great context for me.
Sometimes you do big things when you break up.
Hey, it happens.
Or when you get engaged. And
Yeah,
I got engaged, and like a
Yeah.
week later, I'm like running for office.
Yeah.
My wife's like, what? Did I sign up for this?
For real.
So no big life changes. So I guess kind of in thinking about that, and as you were thinking about running, what did you see then as the kind of the most pressing challenges of the criminal system? And do you see a difference in terms of those challenges between then and now? Do you think the challenges are much more difficult? Do you think they're the same? Just kind of curious to get your sense of like what you were actually running to try and change about the criminal system. Let's start with you, Chesa.
You know, running for office and being in elected office, as Tiffany and I have both done now, you learn. And hopefully in any new job and any new kind of experience in life, you grow and you learn, and I think that's a good thing. Sometimes learning and growing means changing. Sometimes it means, getting older and more mature, or as my parents said in the 60s, don't trust anybody over the age of 30. I think 2019, when we both ran, was a very different moment politically, especially around criminal justice, than the one that we're in now. And there was no way to predict COVID or George Floyd or any of the things that happened in the few years after we ran. I think as we look back, 2019, 2020 feel like something of a high watermark for, not forever, but like in the short term, right? In the medium term, they feel like a high watermark for public consciousness around criminal justice reform, for kind of national awareness around police violence, racial justice issues. And now we're dealing with a very intense reaction. I'm not going to say backlash. I don't think that's the appropriate term for reasons we can talk about, but there's a very intense, mostly top-down reaction to and pushback on criminal justice reform that's having an effect. So yeah, when I took office, there was much more political space. When I ran for office, when I took office, much more political space than there is now around these issues. And so yeah, at that time, I was thinking about and I was coming from the perspective really of a public defender. That's who I was when I ran for office. I didn't pretend to be anything else. So I was thinking about things like bail reform. I still don't believe that anybody's freedom should be determined based on their wealth. I think it's a fundamental basic principle. It should be based on risk, not wealth. So I was really determined to do things like end the use of cash bail at arraignment, which we did, as Rachel mentioned. I was focused on trying to reduce the use of really draconian sentencing enhancements in California that exacerbate and amplify racial disparities without any public safety benefit. I was really excited about trying to do some more nerdy things like open file discovery so that we weren't hiding the ball from the defenders, and to stop prosecuting youth as adults, and to get the last people in California's death row out of San Francisco County. Believe it or not, there was still somebody on death row out of San Francisco when I took office in 2020, and get them off death row. Basic things like that. I could go on. But I think now, to answer the other part of your question, like, this is a very different moment. I really like the organizing training work that this group out of Boston, the INE Collective, does. Some of you may be familiar, and they talk about seasons of change. And you know, we could have a debate about whether this is like winter or autumn, but it ain't spring or summer for criminal justice.
That's
It
right.
is not spring or summer. 2019 was spring, 2020 was probably summer, and now we're in the fall or the winter, depending on how you want to define it. So I think, like, as a movement, however we view ourselves, whatever our role is as intellectuals, as scholars, as practitioners, as donors, as allies, like, we have to recognize the moment we're in, and that doesn't mean like retreat into your shell and give up. It means let's do the difficult work in this moment. Let's recognize this is a time when we can kill bad bills in the legislature. This is a time when we can do education work and research, when we can do training of the next generation, when we can do a reflection on what we, successes and missed opportunities, and when we can be prepared for when spring comes to take better advantage and go further and be more effective than we were last time around. And I think that's my kind of sanguine analysis of the moment we're in. This is not the time to say, let's do all the things that need to be done, even though I have the same sense of urgency, even though I know that people are suffering every day, that the system is perpetuating injustices every day. I think the political space isn't there in this moment, and we have to be strategic and effective about defending our wins. We have to be really proud of how far we've come, because it is easy, especially for folks who are new to this work, for the law students in the room who may be of a different generation or maybe aren't directly impacted and are excited about criminal justice reform and feel like it's hopeless in this moment. Let me just tell you something. I'm not that old. Believe it or not. Believe it or not. And when I went to law school, like, people didn't know what the term mass incarceration meant. It wasn't mainstream conversation. When I went to college, my freshman year, we were doing an orientation and a icebreaker, get to know you. I was at Yale College, right? Rachel told you that. 3 truths and a lie, right? You know the game where you try to get to know people, you tell people 4 things, 3 of them are true, 1's a lie. So I'm like, I was on the high school soccer team. I studied French. I like to travel, and both of my parents are in prison. And somebody's like, immediately, oh, well, nobody at Yale has parents in prison. Of course, that's the lie. I'm like, no, I studied Spanish. Right? That was not that long ago. And we're in such a different place in terms of national consciousness, in terms of the actual policies and laws on the books, and in terms of the number of people in cages in this country. Like, California has reduced the number of people in state prison by about half from peak. Like, we have a long way to go. We have a lot of work ahead of us. We have to be really intensely wary of backsliding, but we cannot take for granted the progress that we have made. It has been long, hard work. A lot of people in this room have been doing that work, have been leaders in that work, have been inspirational in that work, litigating, drafting legislation, publishing scholarship, documenting, helping to demystify and understand what's really happening. And we have to build on that platform and celebrate it as we get ready for spring.
You're gonna have to repeat the question.
No, I'm happy to.
It's my ADHD brain.
Yeah, so I guess I'm curious, kind of, when you were running for DA, what did you see as the most kind of pressing challenges, concerns, or problems in the criminal system? And I guess, as Chesa kind of put it, in some ways, like, if you're running today, what would your platform look like?
Well, let's be clear, I wouldn't do it today. Also, having never run for office before, you talk about how big San Francisco is. Queens is 2.5 million people. I did not know what I was getting into from an electoral perspective and running a campaign. I love that you brought up the INE Institute, because I also attended the INE Institute, and they are incredible if you don't know about them. But in addition to talking about seasonality, right? Like, it's about movement and movement ecology. And so in addition to talking about movements having seasons and the life of movements being strong, or long, I should say. They are strong, but long. Just recognizing and being in alignment with what season you're in is going to be really important in moving your movement forward. But also the ecology of it is, where you find yourself in once you locate yourself within a movement. Once you say, I am part of the movement to end mass incarceration, or whatever it is, being like, well, are we changing dominant institutions? Are we engaging in mass protest? Are we doing the work of personal transformation? Are we doing the work of alternatives, right? Setting the outside examples and understanding that they're all in relationship. And what we were doing was choosing, right? It's like the toolbox is there, choosing a set of tools to wield, that being the district attorney role, which for me, always I very firmly understood, or at least within my framework, was that it was harm reduction work at its very best, but that it was still very necessary harm reduction work, and that the power of being able to look at it from that lens and be committed to working with outside partners to give information, to talk about where the roadblocks are, to be really clear about what you could and couldn't do, so that others who are trying to make the same kind of change through different tools, using different pressures, can run more targeted, effective strategies to that end. And so I think, when I think about the challenges, it was always in the context of what I believe is possible in movement. And then the challenges of the day and the politics and everything else. Because to your point, so much of this is top down. Yep. Like it is not rooted at all in what our communities know to be true at their cores. If we're having different kinds of conversations, like the one thing I do love about my job now is that we invest a lot of time in having community-based conversations, which go even deeper than what we call like deep canvassing conversations. And individuals overwhelmingly, like the conversation around public safety has almost nothing to do with policing, punishment, and prosecution. But the challenges are just a lot of like really powerful scare tactics. The challenges are kind of making connections around, people can agree that the status quo isn't working, but a lot of people can't fully ideate what those solutions are. One, because maybe they're directly impacted and are constantly in crisis. And so that is a huge ask to ask of people who are just using so much of their capacity to survive. And then people who just are disconnected because they have the privilege of not being directly impacted. And it's like, I feel like a lot of the challenge was sort of facilitating these connections that we actually, like a lot of us know. But here specifically, we had the same, I think I was like 4 or 5 years old when the former prosecutor was appointed. He wasn't elected. And then nobody ever really recognized that this man was on the ballot every year. There were people like, I vote for my DA, had no idea. So it was an open seat for the first time in a very long time. And so the conversations were very much around bail, around what do we do around violent crime, what do we do on lots of different issues. But I'm going to be really honest with you, I didn't really see them as challenges because I came in with this mindset of like, we have absolutely nothing to lose. And I remember a good friend of mine, great thought partner, he's just brilliant. His name is Alon Gur. He lives in Philadelphia, but his brother works for Larry Krasner, actually doing policy with him, but he had done some policy work with Larry, and I was introduced to him and we became very, very good friends. But he was recanting, he was telling me the story about how, people told Larry, when he told them what he wanted to run on, somebody told him, like, you can't, if you run on one of those things, you'll lose. And so Larry's response in true Larry fashion was like, fuck it, I'll run on all of them. Which was like, I was like, then when I was convinced to do it, I was like, hold my beer, guys. Like, we're just gonna run, I don't care about what the challenges are. We're gonna run on the most decarceral platform ever. We're gonna focus on the kinds of conversations that need to happen, right? Like, we're gonna make it clear that no matter who you are, where you are in the political spectrum, how you feel about these things, we have one thing in common. And it's that you and I, we want the safest, healthiest communities possible, and I am gonna spend whatever time it takes to talk about what isn't getting us there now and what the possibilities could be. And so I didn't really see it as a challenge, any of it. It was just like, this is what we're going with, and all I see are opportunities. And I think that mindset is also important in this moment, and connecting it to seasonality is that we've come so far in so long, and we're thinking about a system that has been built over centuries. And I can't imagine, like I couldn't have imagined we're talking about the things that we're talking about now and have accomplished some of those things. But just, I mean, right now we're in a tough spot in New York City. I mean, we've got a mayor that is hell-bent on just pursuing failed strategies over and over and over again, cutting the budget of things that we know to be safer, that would make us safer and healthier. And the conversations we're having, quite frankly, is I'm like, we gotta hold our ground. Our job in this moment is to not cede ground, right? And prepare and wait for when we have the opportunities, what we call in movement ecology as like those bubble bursting moments, to be ready to like move into a spring or summer. Yeah. But quite honestly, right now we're like, yo, we gotta hold our ground. That's real.
So on that point, kind of the hold your ground point, like what do you think accounts for the kind of reaction the reactionary season that we're in right now? Chesa, you said you don't want to call it a backlash, and I think that's probably right, not to try and call it that, but I'm wondering, what do you think accounts for the fact that we've kind of gone so far, and then it seems like right now there is absolutely no appetite to do anything progressive around the criminal legal system. There's no appetite to do anything that would be thoughtful or even near the lines of the campaigns that you both ran in 2019.
Yeah, I guess, first of all, I want to try to cite my sources. And part of the reason that I don't call it a backlash is because I've learned from some of my colleagues at Berkeley Law School, including one who's in the room, Becca Goldstein, when you dig in on the numbers, when you look at the actual political science behind what's been happening, voters are not rejecting the policies or the candidates who have been elected on these platforms. They're just not. But there is tremendous resistance and effective efforts to undermine them from the top, from police unions, from attorney generals, from mayors, from city council people in some cases, present company obviously excluded. And that's just a very different thing than having voters say, we supported this, but now we don't. And we can dig in on that and talk about the numbers. I'm not the expert, Becca Goldstein is, she's in the room with us, but we can talk about the examples. People like Larry Krasner, Kim Foxx, who, if you believe the narrative in the press, were doomed in their reelection campaigns. I mean, I remember when Larry was running for reelection in, 2021, and the polls were saying he was doomed, and the guy running against him had the full support of the police union, and everybody was running scared. And he won with like 2/3 of the vote. Same thing with Kim Foxx, outspent, outgunned, powers that be undermining them, and voters said, this is what we elected and this is what we want. That doesn't mean there aren't real challenges, right? And it doesn't mean that the energy or the zeitgeist in the kinds of conversations Tiffany just described that she has, the deep conversations in community, haven't changed. They've changed a lot. There is absolutely a perception across the country that crime is on the rise. And in some communities, in some categories, in some moments, that's true. As it is always true if you look at particular time frames and particular categories of crime. Overall, if you look at data, crime is at or near historic lows in most categories. Overall, the kinds of reform policies that we ran for and that we've advocated for have been extremely effective at redirecting tax dollars into community-based solutions, prevention, victim services, reentry, things that build long-term safety. But fear is an unbelievably powerful motivating force in politics. And this isn't just true with regard to public safety policy. It's true in every other area of policy as well. Immigration, xenophobia, we see that playing out across the country right now. And I think fundamentally what's changed since 2019 is that, for a variety of reasons we can talk about, people in this moment are very, very scared about public safety issues, and they conflate things like mental illness, drug addiction, unhoused communities with traditional law and order criminal issues in ways that have really blurred the lines around what the role of the criminal legal system can and should be, and what kinds of solutions are effective at solving these problems. So I'll give you one little example. In San Francisco, we have about 8,000 unhoused people on our streets on any given day. That number's been flat to the best of our understanding, obviously imperfect data, but it's been flat for about the last 10 years. We have 850,000 people total, so much smaller than New York, right? Much smaller than even Queens. We have 50% of the budget of New York City for homelessness, right? We spend per capita way more than New York does on homelessness. And we haven't been able to reduce the number of people on our streets in a 10-year period, despite all that money. And instead of building shelters or supportive housing or affordable housing or long-term transitional opportunities for people to get off the street and on their feet, what the city has done over the last 10 years is pretend to do those things and increasingly say, this isn't compassionate, compassion's killing people. These are direct quotes from our mayor, by the way. Compassion is killing people, they're treatment resistant, they refuse services. And now San Francisco has joined Trump-appointed federal judges in asking the US Supreme Court, Trump-controlled, Trump-dominated, to reverse a well-established Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals opinion that says local governments cannot prosecute people for being homeless unless there are available shelters that they refuse to go to. Instead of building available shelters first, San Francisco is saying, we want to just prosecute them now. That's where we're at. And they're saying this is a criminal problem. Let me just say, if it's not obvious to people in this room, why that's so problematic. It's not just the hypocrisy of Democratic, quote unquote, Democratic elected officials who run for office on their anti-Trump credentials. It's not just the dehumanization of our most vulnerable neighbors and community members. It's also that fundamentally, you cannot lock your way up out of poverty. People go to jail, they get out, they still don't have a place to live, right? That doesn't solve the problem. And even if you're like a traditional, there might be some in the room, there might be some traditional law and order prosecutors in the room. The San Francisco criminal justice system, and this is true across the country, does not have the capacity to take on yet another social welfare problem. It doesn't have the capacity, just like it can't solve the drug addiction crisis or the mental health crisis. When you start dumping hundreds or thousands, 8,000 unhoused people, those cases onto our criminal legal system, not only is it going to fail to solve those problems, but it's going to result in the kinds of cases that I believe should be the priority for criminal prosecutions, like murder and rape and domestic violence. And this is not to say we shouldn't be building alternatives in those spaces where possible as well, but you're not going to prosecute those cases effectively. What is happening in San Francisco today, under my successor in office, is they've relaunched the war on drugs. They're now prosecuting simple possession, drug paraphernalia, homelessness, and the number of fatal overdoses has hit an all-time high. Way more people dying of fentanyl overdoses today than when we had a harm reduction approach in my administration. And get this tough on crime prosecutor is having dozens of cases dismissed in court every day because they don't have courtrooms and prosecutors are not ready for trial. Literally, you don't need to take my word for it. The San Francisco Standard did a story about it. Every day you go into our misdemeanor courtroom and cases that I filed, right? That the person who supposedly didn't want to let everybody out of jail, don't prosecute, don't care about victims, they said, cases that we filed 2 years ago that we thought should be prosecuted, at least send somebody to diversion, have some kind of accountability, they are dismissing every day because they're too busy criminalizing poverty. It doesn't work. And that's the moment we're in, because people are conflating social problems like homelessness with crime and public safety.
So what I heard in that answer, Jason, was a little bit about kind of the limits of what you see that the criminal system can do and what prosecutors can do in some ways. And I'm curious, for you, Councilmember Caban, you ran for city council after your run for prosecutor. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about what you see as limits and maybe opportunities in that particular role, maybe what inspired you to make that move.
Yeah. One thing I just want to add to what Taysa said was I do think, in terms of why we're seeing some of the regressive policies take hold that we're seeing, has everything to do with racialized capitalism and its stronghold on our political system, because it's not that the things that we have won aren't working, it's that the opposition keeps dumping and pouring more and more and more money into upholding those harmful systems that they profited from, right? And so you'll see school districts, I forget which school district around in another part of the country had taken all of their their school safety agents out of the school system. And then, new leadership came in, political leadership, and brought them all back in. Not because they weren't getting results, but because his campaign coffers were padded by, the unions and interests that profited off of those things. And so you see that a lot, and the reality is that, I mean, the recalls we're seeing and stuff like that is a good example. They got way more money than we do, and it's a real problem. And you're able to create these perceptions, and this will get into your question, because it is what sort of drove me to do what I'm doing now, because I do think it's just the continuation of the same work. It's actually the other side of the coin, really. But and interesting, and to say that this is coming from the top down, and it's not sort of a populist theory or the majoritarian opinion. When our mayor, this mayor, did the biggest survey in our city's history, actually, around public safety, and asked thousands and thousands and thousands of everyday New Yorkers, what's the number one thing that we need to make our communities safer? They said housing. They didn't say cops. They said housing, like very, very clearly. And then there are all of these other kind of surveys and polling that's been done that's interesting after the gubernatorial race with Kathy Hochul and some of the House races, and like what happened there, and them saying, well, a big issue is, yes, inflation, but also safety. And the breakdown of the questions I thought were really interesting, and it leads me into the work that I'm doing now. But people were asked, well, do you think we are less safe, or crime is up, or the city is less safe? And the people who said yes, when they were asked the follow-up question of, but do you think your neighborhood is less safe? Do you think your block is less safe? Overwhelmingly, those people said, no, it feels the same. And so it's this like interesting psychology of, we have been fed, right, this propaganda around like, we're less safe. And then when you ask somebody, but is your day-to-day different? Like, how do you feel in your block with your people? They're like, no, it's fine. It's just out there that's not safe. And so I'm angry about it, which I think is a really interesting thing. But that moves me into like 2020 and the sort of racial reckoning, the uprising around George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and that intersecting with a global health pandemic. Because I had been asked to run again pretty immediately after I ran for DA. I had been asked to run for the state legislature, and everything in my body was like, no, I am, first of all, I'm not recovered from this, and I had such a visceral reaction in my body to that ask that I just knew it was not aligned. I liked what I was doing, and I just also needed time to heal, because it was traumatic. But I continued to get asked, and then in the middle of this period of time, I was getting asked again, and here were people who were taking to the streets to protest police violence and being met with more police violence, while every single person, like the pandemic was just, talk about bubble bursting moments, how it like everybody was affected by the things that we had been talking about all the time. Like, no matter who you are, where you find yourself in your life, you now understood the fear of not being able to access healthcare, even if you had good insurance, right? Like, you had a whole subset of people who are now worrying about their housing and their mortgage payments and all of these different things that maybe had never held that fear around their housing before, right? Like, all of these different areas where we're talking about, the most sort of marginalized, oppressed, extracted from communities, lower income, black and brown, disability, queer, trans, immigrant. Well, now you had a whole swath of people with varying levels of privilege that typically did not experience and touch these issues and fears. We're all feeling them in this moment. And that also felt, as horrible as that was, that felt like a real opportunity for paradigm shifting and for like driving through some really transformative change. And so at that point, I was being asked to run again, and it made a lot of sense. And I thought about what you could do as a council member. And when I thought about, the role of DA being harm reduction, where you could take that job and use restraint, where you could take that job and focus your resources on, bad landlords instead of people experiencing homelessness, or corporations that are, committing wage theft rather than workers who might do something out of desperation, whatever it is. But that the city council was in the position to make the laws and budget for the things that built out the continuum of care that we need, like the life-affirming infrastructure that we need. Now, it's clearly not as easy as that of being like, get in the council, you're gonna be able to build these things. The 51-person body that is a lot less democratic than you might think it would be. And then we are also a city and a state that is very heavily, it's very heavily weighted towards the executive. So the legislative body's power is quite limited. But I did it because I really saw opportunities to start talking about the solutions and being in those rooms where some of those solutions could be enacted.
So I want to turn over to the audience to ask some questions as well, but I have one last question before I do that, and it is, so you're obviously both still involved and engaged in the work. The same sort of work you were doing, maybe in different roles in different spaces, but the same sort of work you were doing to try and transform the way the criminal system operates. I'm wondering kind of what keeps you hopeful about that mission. What would you tell a law student today who's sitting in the audience and maybe been abolitionist and says, you know what, playing any of these roles is legitimizing a system I already cannot stand, and I want to tear down. What would you say to folks?
You sound like the law students at Berkeley.
I mean, first of all, I will say it's very cool, and a marker of how things have even changed is John Jay College. Like when I was growing up, that was the college that churned out cops, right? But now it's a very interesting population at John Jay College. Like, yes, you still have people that are really interested in pursuing law enforcement, but you have all of these awesome radical abolitionists, folks that are doing something wildly. That is somebody needs to do a study just on that. Like that is a really, really incredible. And I'm assuming you have a connection to the, yeah. It's just like such a beautiful thing to see.
Let me just say, my former communications director and policy advisor, Rachel Marshall, now leads the Institute for Innovative Prosecution at John Jay. So
it's
to
amazing.
your point,
See? Yeah, it's cool, cool thing. Like you can track a lot of the changes happening. For folks who don't know, I am just a really unapologetic abolitionist socialist who, yes, ran for DA. And there are people to be like, well, what are you talking about? Like, how can you do that? And again, it's because I view everything through this lens and framework of movement ecology and saying, there are powerful positions that exist, and we cannot give up the ability to wield and use that power to reduce harm so that other people in other places in the strategy, in the ecosystem, can continue to do the thing, right? There are people who are on the outside flank of abolitionist work who can do things that I cannot do. But you sure as hell better believe that there are things that I get to do that's really wild, that from that outside with those tools and things, they cannot do. But the magic is being in relationship. And that doesn't mean being the absence of tension, but the communication and the sharing of strategies and the moving forward together, and just also the mindset of, because people say the same thing about public defenders too, right? Well, you're legitimizing this system. And it's the same thing for social workers in institutional settings. If you can go into those spaces and say, I understand that I am complicit. And complicit does not have to be an entirely dirty word. I am aware of my complicity in this system, but I also understand why I'm here, who I'm trying to help, what harm I'm trying to reduce, and I have a consciousness around this bigger thing, and I'm contributing to it in lots of different ways. And people are at different places in their sort of political development and their development on strategies, and I will never knock anybody for that. And there are some folks that are just I hold these political values and ideology, and I don't fuck with these folks, and that's cool too. It means that we might not be able to work like this because whatever, but there's a whole group in here, but it doesn't mean that part of the equation isn't necessary. Like, we need those folks too. And so like there's no love lost there either, but it's just how I do the best I can. I do the best I can to be really clear about what my politics and values are. I do the best I can to locate myself within something that feels a lot larger. And sometimes I'll get it right, and sometimes I won't. And my goal is just to be in deep enough relationship with folks to be able to talk about it.
I want to echo, a lot of what Tiffany said, and I think, it's difficult in this moment around a lot of issues, right? We're talking about criminal justice, but there's a lot of other issues in the world today that people feel really strongly about, that people should feel really strongly about, that people understandably feel like they need to draw lines about what side they're on in this moment. And I think particularly when you're a certain age and you're in a certain moment, you're getting education, you're getting empowered to use the law to try and build a career, but also impact the world around you, it makes sense that we get these questions from our students all the time. It makes sense. Those are good questions to be asking. And I told you earlier I'm not that old. Now I'm going to sound really old. But one of the things that I encourage students to do is to reflect on who they are, right? And one way to think about it, right, is we all have a unique fingerprint, all of us. Whatever our shared values are, or lived experiences, whatever our commonalities as humans, like, we all have a unique fingerprint. And I'm not trying to bolster junk science in the courtroom here.
I was about to say.
But
It's not,
right,
it's not quite.
right, I'm not going
Not
there.
quite all unique,
don't
but-
go there.
We
But-
all have unique bite mark
Yeah,
analysis.
no,
Yeah,
God, yeah.
Tool market.
None of that. I'm not talking about forensic science.
In a metaphorical sense.
In a metaphorical sense.
Okay.
My point is this, right, is that, and this really dovetails with what Tiffany was saying. We need broad movements if we're going to be successful, if we're going to effectuate change, if we're going to have change that's lasting. And part of building broad movements requires us to be less dogmatic than a lot of folks on the left like to be. Now, what I say to the students is, if you identify as an abolitionist, to use your example, or like 90% of the students at our law school, right? If you identify as an abolitionist, then maybe you don't want to go be a prosecutor. That's a great thing to know about yourself. That's a great thing. You also might not want to be a public defender, because 90% of what you do is advise people to waive their rights and plead guilty. You may not be comfortable in that role. That's okay too. Look at your fingerprint. Figure out who you are, and find a role where you can lean in and be comfortable with the work you're doing. If, on the other hand, you're somebody who believes in decarceration, but is comfortable getting your hands dirty, is comfortable making difficult decisions, who understands that the path from where we are to the world you want to live in is a winding road, then maybe you go work for somebody like Larry Krasner, and you join that movement in that way. And if you're the person that's going to be the public defender, or that's going to be working at the ACLU, or that's going to be suing the state prison system, you should be really glad that there's somebody else out there with a different fingerprint who's comfortable getting their hands dirty. Because we need broad movements if they're going to be strong movements. And fundamentally, the way that I stay hopeful, even in moments, because this, I think, was part of your question that I want to make sure we address, like, even in moments where we look around the world, we look at the suffering, we look at the starvation, we look at U.S. complicity in horrific violence, we look at the jails and the prison, we look at innocent people being processed through these systems, and you say to yourself, how can we go forward? Where's the hope? We all have those moments. And I think a really important thing to remember is that a life of service is a life from which we can derive tremendous meaning, satisfaction, and dignity. Tiffany said this. I mean, there are people, I don't care what's happening in the world, there are people right here in our community who are in desperate need of a good lawyer. And if you're a law student who's about to have a bar card, like, there are ways you can go out there and use that bar card to dignify and lift up the voices of people who have been marginalized for generations. And even if you don't win, right? There's a great book by a law professor at Carnegie Mellon who works at the Center for Constitutional Rights a few blocks away from here. The book is called Success Without Victory. Sometimes as a public defender, that's your lot in life. You don't win most of your cases, but you're successful because you humanize and dignify your client. And that's something that we can all take real pride in doing in our careers, even if the winter's long, even if we lose our case, even if we're somehow, some way complicit in a system that we're fighting to change. the alternative? Throwing our hands up, sitting in the armchair, and complaining about the world? That's no alternative at all. So step up and do the work.
So I know a couple folks are holding microphones. I don't know if folks in the audience have questions they want to ask. Okay.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk, and I don't think most of it was directed at me. I've been there, and obviously I have to acknowledge, even though this isn't a AA meeting or something, I was a failure. I think our political system as it is now clearly shows that my generation didn't do it right. But what I struggle with, and I'd love to hear from you in your campaign, it's great to get the kids psyched for it, but they have to have some tools that work, and obviously what you see on the Republican side of things resulted in really what happened to you. Is there anything that came out of that? And it's nice for you to identify certain things that, well, look at the results we see. The streets aren't better. There are more people dying. But what can people who believe like you, and I believe like you, that we want to do things differently, you have to be able to present something. And sometimes you have to keep it a lot simpler and a lot more, it basically has to become TikTok, simple little things. And I didn't hear any of that. I didn't hear any way that you would, looking back now, do you think you could have done other things to avoid losing the recall?
First of all, thank you. And let me just say, I'm thanking you because if I were good at dumbing things down, I would have stayed in politics. Instead, I became an academic, right? There's a reason, right? There's a reason for that. I don't want to dumb things down. I'm not good at it. I don't think that should be the goal. And I have tremendous respect for the patience that Tiffany has to demonstrate every day in her conversations with her constituents, some of whom are brilliant, inspirational, creative, amazing people, and some of whom are totally captured by fear-mongering, inevitably. I'm not targeting her constituents in particular. This is across the country.
I got some good ones.
I know you do.
Good constituents.
And we all do. But there's an ex-president who said the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter. I don't believe that, but I think it's a risk when our media has as much power as it does. And when people are as susceptible to fear-mongering, especially with TikTok, with Twitter, with Instagram, I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, except to say that I think all of us have a tremendous responsibility. And I look around the room, I'm looking at people, I'm looking at Rachel Barkow, I'm looking at Barry Scheck, I'm looking at Jeff Fagan, I'm looking at Jason Williamson. We have people in this room who are literally doing the work of demystifying and making accessible and educating the next generation of people. So that work is critically important, it has to continue. And to your second part of your question, I actually don't believe that there is any 1 or 2 or 5 things I could have done differently that would have prevented the recall, other than if I somehow could have stopped the COVID pandemic. And we could have a long conversation about it, but what I will say briefly, in the interest of hearing from other voices, is first of all, the COVID pandemic so dramatically transformed crime trends and judicial process and public perception of safety, and and it coincided almost exactly with my inauguration. I was in office 2 months when COVID hit, less than 2 months. It just was too big a disruption in our lives that was too easy for my detractors to associate with me. And the other part of it, I think, that's really important to remember is that, and this is technical, go read Becca's forthcoming book if you want to be in the weeds on this stuff, but, and I'm not getting any royalties, I promise, it's just a good book. The reality is that when I got recalled in 2022, I had more votes and a higher percentage of the turnout opposing the recall than I did when I got elected. So despite whatever mistakes I made, I'm sure I made lots, despite the $10 million in attacks and the police union work stoppage and the media onslaught, despite all of that, 15,000 more people voted against my recall than had voted to elect me in the first place. So no, I don't have regrets about we did this policy or we were too fast on that. Like, my regret is that the structures that allowed the opponents of criminal justice reform to create an election where I was running against myself. I mean, we all know there is a presidential election coming up later this year. It's a source of tremendous anxiety for many of us. And we also all know that President Biden will, to a statistical certainty, get 50% of the vote plus or minus 2. It's that plus or minus that worries us.
Yeah.
Imagine for a moment if instead of running against Donald Trump, President Biden were running against himself. Yes or no, shall he finish office? What would he get? 20, 30% of the vote? Right? A huge number of people who will vote for him are motivated to do so by fear of Donald Trump becoming president, not by any notion that Joe Biden is the best person to be president. And when I was recalled, voters didn't have the choice of who should replace me. There were no other ideas competing with mine or putting forward a platform for an alternative vision. In fact, the people behind the recall said they believed in criminal justice reform too. They happen to be lying, but no media outlets would hold them to account because there was nobody running. Yes or no? So I don't think that's the right framework. I think that framework leads us to like negativity, to this idea that criminal justice reform is is not popular. I just don't think that's true when you talk to people on the streets, or look at polling or read Becca's book.
I also, if I could add to it very briefly, there's like a layer of the analysis that's really necessary that is often missing, and then that's where I put on like my 2 years where I full-time was an electoral operative. Because it's so much of it also is about the science and math of electoral items in general, and about who has more money to get in front of more people in a quick amount of time to like ingrain a certain message or a thing. Right, like if I use my DA race as an example, I lost by 0.06 of 1%. Being somebody who had never run for office before, had a 6-month runway to do that work against a career politician with over $1 million in her coffers, who had already run and won borough-wide, so had name recognition. People across the borough had already filled in a bubble with her name before, which voter psychology, again, like once you have filled in the bubble for a person, you are exponentially, no matter who's running against them, more likely to fill in that same bubble again. And when I think about those 55 votes of a difference, I am telling you, the winning or losing had everything to do with whether we had enough money and resources and maybe a little bit more time to get in front of more people, right? Like, give us another week from the primary date, we would have gotten more than those 55 votes, right? And so there's like a lot of different ways that you can make the math. And I think also there's this real, there's like this large energy of being like, well, the left, they don't talk about stuff the right way. And part of it, I get a little bit defensive because I'm like, you can't tell people how to talk about their experiences and how they want to talk about it. I mean, we can have conversations about strategy, but the fact of the matter too is that the same things that a lot of people are like, you can't say that, it's divisive, it's not going to work. You go 2, 3, 4, 5 years later, that stuff is polling so high. It's like, it's a really interesting phenomenon. And so you need people who are committed to that messaging early so that it like takes root and it resonates and it grows. And then the missing part of that equation is expanding the electorate, right? Because if you were just going by who the status quo electorate, you are missing the experiences, the narratives, the sentiments, the change that a whole host of people are really hungry for, but aren't engaging in the electoral process. And so I have always thought in a lot of these different spaces that the difference between, quote unquote, winning or losing has everything to do with expanding the electorate and having the electorate be more representative of everyday people, but more specifically, having a larger percentage of the electorate be the people who were systemically not given access, which is like chicken and egg and catch 22, right? Because it was designed to keep those folks from holding on to electoral power to then be able to elect people into office who are then accountable to them and then have to forward those things. But yeah.
I think we have time for maybe one more question. Let's see.
Mike?
Thanks a lot. It's probably more of a comment, but I liked your analogy or the metaphor to the fingerprint. So people might look at me on paper and look at Tiffany on paper and think that we're polar opposites. We're talking about traditional prosecutor. I've been at the Department of Justice as a supervisor for 27 years of my 31-year career. After I left Morningside Heights in Columbia, I came here to NYU. I was in Ken Thompson's first year section, and he was one of the most serious students in the class. I couldn't hold a candle to him, and we miss him dearly. I grew up in a minority working class neighborhood, the son of an auto mechanic and a babysitter, and I came to NYU because I wanted to pursue criminals to incarcerate them if that was appropriate. But I think of myself as being very far left-leaning at the same time. So I want to assure Tiffany that, as you know, Chesa, I think that line prosecutors certainly exert influence on their bosses. And line prosecutors who report to me certainly exert influence on me. And that we can, and I think often, do the right thing. So please, Tiffany, I want you to not
I hear you.
worry so much. I also want everybody to vote, because if everybody did vote, Donald Trump would not win the election. And maybe I should be careful saying that as a federal prosecutor. But I'm speaking in my own personal capacity, not that of DOJ. But I am curious, though, about what you said, Chase, about the criminalization of poverty. How is it that people are being prosecuted for being homeless? Well, I think I missed something that you said.
First of all, thank you for the comment and thank you for the service. And I just want to also emphasize, I think your comment, it's really important as we think about transforming, like whatever the vision is, like whether, obviously people in this room have different lived experiences, different professional experiences. Whatever the vision is, the idea that you're going to elect somebody to office and that they're going to, from one day to the next, change everything about the way the office is run, that's not how democracy works. It's probably not how democracy should work. There are people who have dedicated decades of their life to public service. We may disagree with some of the things they've been doing, but I guarantee you most people in most DA's offices across this country are doing that work, not because they want to exacerbate racial disparities or because they think that they're persecuting communities of color. They're doing it because they believe it's a way to advance justice. And we may have disagreements about whether they are in fact doing that or about whether they're causing more harm than good. But going in, as I can tell you, learn the hard way, going into those offices and saying, all of you people have been doing this for 20 years, you're part of the problem. And expecting them to get on board with reforms is not an effective strategy for change. It is not. We have to figure out a way to honor and respect the tremendous experience, the personal sacrifice that people have made to take careers in public service, even as we push for change that we believe, maybe I think correctly, is urgently needed. And we will be far more effective at getting buy-in from people within those big, deeply entrenched, often civil service bureaucracies than if we say to them, you are the problem, you don't know what you're talking about, I as an outsider who've never prosecuted a case know the solution to these problems that you've been dealing with for decades, right? I mean, so I think we have to have a little bit more humility than often, and I'm guilty as charged here on this, than often I think we do when we go into that role. Criminalization of poverty is done a lot of different ways, to answer the specific question, and it's done a lot of different ways all over the country, and it has been for generations. It's not a new thing. I mean, sit-lie laws are one of the main ways it's done. So you have laws that basically allow police to arrest people and prosecutors to prosecute people for things like setting up a tent on public property, trespassing on public property, blocking a sidewalk. Sometimes it's health and safety code violations if there aren't public restrooms available, other things that give police a hook to make an arrest and prosecutors to try and seek some kind of a conviction, usually a de minimis jail sentence, but enough to really disrupt, which is the goal, disrupt people's lives in the hopes that they will disappear. I think it's ineffective and inhumane, and I think it, in a world of limited resources, I think it's a horrible misjudgment for prosecutors to say we're going to do that while other more serious cases, even misdemeanors, DUIs, vandalism, get dismissed as a result. But there's tremendous political pressure from very, very powerful people in San Francisco and beyond right now to focus police and prosecutor resources on those kinds of cases.
Yeah, and can I also just add that I think that we're in a place now where there's an overwhelming consensus that we criminalize poverty, mental health, and substance use, right? Like we hear that all the time. I've said it a million times over, but I think the thing that we don't talk about enough now is that we also criminalize trauma. And that probably is one of the things that we have not really wrestled and contended with, and I've been thinking about it a lot. We don't really work well or treat trauma, period. Like, forget about criminalizing it. We don't treat it in our medical care system. And so trauma destabilizes enough to collectively create all of these different social ills, whether it's through the ways that you are not able to process trauma, whether it's through inabilities to cope, whether it's through just how your pain presents. I met this really, really brilliant, wonderful human being. His name is Dr. Punch. He's out in St. Louis. And he started he's a black trans trauma surgeon. And he started the BRIC. It's a bullet-related injury clinic. And it intersects with the criminal legal system work because he's part of sort of the violence interruption ecosystem and network. But also he talks about just the medical care system and how when somebody comes in with a bullet-related injury, I swear, I know it seems a little bit off, but I swear there's a point. Bullet-related injury, that you get treated for that wound and then you're sent out with no aftercare. And actually, they don't diagnose, won't diagnose PTSD for at least 45 days post an incident like that, but there is no aftercare to prevent the development of PTSD in that period of time. So now you have a person who has this physical wound that then grows into something much deeper and much more unwieldy to sort of like manage, especially when the continuum of care for that does not exist at all. And he talks about bullets being a very particular kind of injury because it's a disembodied injury. Like there's something that does something to you more when you're hurt by a bullet than when you do by hand-to-hand combat or a knife or something, because to some degree in that kind of situation, you can defend yourself some, but there's nothing to defend you from a gun. And so the psychological effect of that is like really destabilizing. But I say all that to say is that like we are also never going to get to where we need to be if we are limiting the analysis on we criminalize poverty, mental health, substance use, which we do, and I think that we collectively have a better understanding about that. But we criminalize trauma, and if we don't start taking that really seriously and building out a continuum of care for trauma, I think that what we hope to accomplish by recognizing and acting on the knowing of the criminalization of poverty, we're never actually really going to get the kinds of results we really, really want without sort of like contending with trauma as well. Because he said something that I will forever think about like every day at this point. He's like, forget about the trauma that we're creating every day by not having this continuum of care, not acknowledging the trauma in our criminal legal system and not acknowledging it in our healthcare system. Like forget about if we did that tomorrow, there's still existing trauma that could fuel the next 2 decades of violence that we haven't contended with. And I find myself thinking about that a lot.
Let's end on a positive note. Somebody, I don't know, come on, not to take anything away from that, but like,
Listen, I say all that to say though, but I'm fascinated by it, I'm energized by it, and I'm super hopeful around what the possibilities are.
I'll just say, first of all, thank you again for bringing us together. Thank you for the diversity of opinions and the energy in this room. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to sit alongside Tiffany, who's been a friend and an inspiration for years now. And thank you all for having the energy and the hope to continue to fight, because I know so many people in this room are doing amazing work, and the strength and the energy when we are in it together from opposite sides of the aisle or different perspectives or different lived experience is far more than the sum of the parts. So thank you.
Definitely. So
Thanks to both of you.
Councilmember Caban and Chesa for joining us tonight. It's been a phenomenal conversation, given a lot to think about. I want to thank Lushan Thompson, as well, for her support of this lecture. I hope you'll follow her guidance and support this lecture as well, as we bring you more great conversations like this. There's refreshments and food, so please take part, and we'll see you hopefully soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.